Welcome back to Midnight Outcry. Tonight we bring you one chilling testimony, an intimate, true account from deep within the Appalachian Mountains. This isn't folklore. It's raw, unfiltered, and terrifying. What happened in those woods left a scar on the storyteller, and it might leave one on you too. If you're drawn to real horror that lingers long after the screen fades, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. Now, listen closely. The mountains remember. I need someone to believe me, therefore I'm sharing this story. 3 months ago, I drove down a road that shouldn't have been. Furthermore, I doubt that I ever returned. All of the town's GPS units display the same item right now. There used to be a forest along this road, but I know the truth about what's actually down there. My name is I've been traveling these mountain roads for 20 years with Jake Morrison. Following the events on Route 19 in West, I doubt I'll ever drive by myself again, Virginia. Since I was 22, I have worked as a long-haul truck driver, following in the footsteps of my father and his predecessors. The Morrisons have been transporting cargo through 3 generations in the Appalachian Mountains. Additionally, we are more familiar with these routes than most people are with their own localities. From Virginia to every bend, grade, and truck stop, I have a mental map of Alabama, much like a personal GPS system. I'm proud in that understanding. Other drivers, however, depend on satellite navigation, and with the use of electronic route planners, I can determine the most efficient route between points A and B without ever having to look at a screen. I am aware of which roads have low traffic and which can accommodate a fully loaded rig, bridges, and which ones, when it rains, become muddy nightmares. It's not only I need a job. Generations of mountain truckers have mastered this technique. The night that everything was different, I was transporting furniture from a North Carolina manufacturing to a Columbus, Ohio warehouse. It was just another run. Over the years, I had probably made 50 trips, generally via Interstate 77, heading north via West Virginia before joining other roads. The weight wasn't really heavy, and I was making good time, even though a production delay caused them to fall 3 hours behind schedule. Just after midnight, as I crossed into West Virginia, I knew I had a long night ahead of me. I had intended to drive to a truck stop, get a couple hours of rest outside Charleston before continuing the marathon to Columbus the following day. There was no one on the roadways, with the exception of the occasional passing automobile, and I was listening to the sporadic discussion on Channel 19 on my CB radio of other drivers at night. At that point, my GPS unit, a state-of-the-art device I'd spent a lot of money the previous year, and recommended something I had never seen in my 20 years of driving these mountains. 2 miles away, the automated voice said, "Turn right for an alternate route. You will save 37 minutes and 42 miles by using this route." I frowned as he looked at the screen. The recommended path revealed a road that went straight through a place I knew to be insurmountable mountainous terrain. The display indicates that this mysterious road would skip Charleston completely and join my intended route close to the Ohio border. "That's impossible," I replied. Mumbled, but I wanted to know. I've been driving for 20 years, yet I've never seen this road on any map, whether digital or not. According to the GPS, it was Route 19, Altu. I had never heard of this designation. I took out my old paper atlas as a test. When I first started driving, my father gave me the same one. The location where the GPS indicated the detour was depicted as little more than contour lines showing rugged, uninhabited mountains with no cities or highways, wilderness. However, 37 minutes could make the difference, and 42 miles was 42 miles, between being penalized for being late and delivering my delivery on time. In opposition to I made the wise decision to look into it. The GPS predicted that the turnoff would emerge precisely where it did. A Route 19 is marked with a green highway sign and a perfectly paved road that branches off to the right. Columbus is 127 miles away. The pavement appeared new, as if it had been installed inside the last year, but there were no orange cones, no construction signs, and no traces of any recent roadwork. The total lack of traffic was what caught my attention right away. If this road is actually Other drivers ought to have been using it as it saved 40 miles on a major transport route. However, I didn't see any taillights in front of me when I turned the corner and began traveling on the new highway. In my mirrors are headlights. The road was exquisitely designed, with soft curves that adhered to the mountain's natural contours and gradients that were never higher than what a fully laden truck could manage. In comfort. Trucking was understood by whoever constructed this highway. The sight lines were flawless. There were even sporadic pull-offs for slower cars, and the shoulders were sufficiently broad for emergency stops. However, there was a problem with the terrain. Driving farther into the highlands, I began to see objects that didn't make sense. At first, there was only a dilapidated conveyor and outdated mining equipment, the skeleton remains of a tipple where coal would have been put onto trucks, a belt, and a few abandoned rail cars. That wasn't out of the ordinary in West Virginia. Relics from the coal industry are scattered throughout the highlands. The peculiar thing was the state of a few pieces of equipment. Among the visibly ancient and corroded equipment were others that appeared to be much more recent. Contemporary excavators, bright yellow bulldozers, and even some pieces with fresh-looking manufacturing tags. It appeared as though mining activities from the same place had been abandoned at different periods and in different decades. Around mile 15, the CB radio began to malfunction. Rather than the customary late night, I was picking up bits and pieces of conversations that seemed like they were from a different time period. Trucker banter. Distorted, scratchy voices talking about shift plans and coal costs in terms I hadn't heard since my tales from grandfathers who worked the mines in the 1950s. Shaft number 4 is producing well. Through the static, one voice could be heard crackling. Tell Morrison to get his boys ready for the early shift. My family's name was Morrison, although they had been, not miners, but truckers, and it sounded as though the voice was from decades ago. I became aware that the mile signs were counting down rather than up at that point. The majority of roads have numerical mile markers, successively from an initial position. Miles 1, 2, 3, and so forth. However, the Route 19 alt markers were numbering backwards. Miles 47, 46, and 45. As if I were moving toward a destination rather than away from a starting point. By mile 30, the inaccuracy of it was getting hard to ignore the problem. I was traveling through what should have been impassable terrain on the route. Mountains. However, the scenery outside my windows didn't like any West Virginian terrain I was familiar with. The ridge lines were incorrect. The forests appeared too dense and archaic, the valleys too deep, and the radio conversation was becoming more distinct. At the Morrison location, a cave in the dispatcher's voice made the announcement clearly and urgently. Every unit reacts. We possess men are confined. How many? A different voice inquired. There are 12 men working nights. Jake Morrison's team. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Jake Morrison, my name. However, I had never had a crew or worked in a mine. The voices were discussing things that couldn't happen and about non-existent persons. I noticed the lights up ahead at that point. At Nate, I initially believed it to be another truck. But when I drew nearer, I saw that it was even stranger. Dispersed throughout a valley. Dozens of lights, the type of industrial lighting found at a busy mining operation, were visible to my left. Machines were running, conveyor belts were in motion, and I could make out the silhouettes of people around the website. However, every map I was aware of indicated that there shouldn't be any active mining in this region. The majority of the activities when the coal ran out, this area of West Virginia was closed years ago. The road was starting to bend downhill. Now they were going down into the valley where the mining activity was. I could see that the alternative Route 19 ended at the mining location. There was no way to go on toward Columbus. No through traffic. The road just came to an end at a sizable parking lot containing work trucks and pickups from various historical periods. A few of the cars appeared present. Chevy Silverados and late-model Ford F-150s that might have been last week, driven off dealer lots. Others were clearly older pickups from the 1980s with paint fading and corrosion. Vehicles from the 1970s that had designs I recognized from my early years. Vehicles that appeared to belong in a museum were also strewn about. Work vehicles from the 1950s and beyond models that I was unable to recognize. It resembled examining 70 years of mining history, parked in the identical space. Since I was unable to halt my truck as it moved into the parking lot, the brakes weren't reacting correctly. The miners were visible to me. They were leaving the mine entrance after their shift, in the direction of the parking lot with the weary, sluggish pace of guys who had been underground for 8 hours. Some wore contemporary safety equipment, LED-lit hard hats, reflective vests, and steel-toed boots that appeared like new. Others donned the more antiquated gear I had saw in historical pictures. Carbide lighting, basic canvas attire, and smooth-shaven leather boots age. And a few of them appeared to have been lifted from old family photos. A slender, tall man with my father's face, dressed in mining gear from the 1960s, approached my pickup head-on. Others followed, men with the features of the Morrison family, each dressed for a different mining era. When I was 12, my grandfather passed away. I had only ever seen old photos of my great-grandfather. Additionally, in the middle of one of the men in the group looked just like me. He had a hard hat with the word foreman stangled on the front. He walked up to the driver's side of my taxi and signaled for me to down the window. He spoke in a voice when I did. That was just like mine. "The night crew has been waiting, Jake. You're late for your shift." "I'm not a child," I said, even if my voice sounded unsure. "I work as a truck driver. I'm only attempting to reach Columbus." It felt like he was gazing into a mirror when he grinned. "Son, Morrison men aren't truck drivers. We are mining workers. Always have, always will. Your crews are waiting in shaft number 4. The remaining miners had encircled my pickup, all of them staring up at me with expectant, patient expressions. Some people I identified from family pictures. Even though they were strangers, others looked distinctly similar to family. The instruments of their work were worn by all of them: pickaxes, shovels, lunchboxes, and safety gear from several decades. "Jake, it's time to come home," my grandfather said, shouted. "Time to join the family business." At that moment, I understood what, in reality, Route 19 alternate was a trap, a detour, and not a shortcut to Columbus. Morrison men had been drawn away from their everyday lives by a paranormal roadway that had been gathering them for generations and into a decades-long, never-ending mining shift. I could sense myself being captivated by their cadence and their anticipations. A part of me desired to descend from to continue the family history of working underground. I will catch a cab and join them. However, my logical side was shouting warnings, so I scrambled for my roadside safety gear and emergency kit, equipment carried by all experienced truck drivers. I found the bright red highway and emergency flares in my hands, flares intended to alert other drivers to vehicles with disabilities. I put the lid on. The miners took a step back, protecting their eyes and their eyes, as the first flare exploded into bright red light. One of them said, "He's not ready," and the solid appearance started to falter like heat waves. "Let him go. He will be back." I threw 2 more flares out the window after lighting them. The harsh substance, whatever magic was keeping my truck in the parking lot, seemed to be broken by light. The motor had been operating, but under my power, roared back to life after being unconscious. I tossed the truck. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking lot as quickly as I could. I could see the miners watching me leave through the side mirrors. They were sorrowful but unsurprised. In what could have been a promise or a farewell, the 4 men who resembled me raised their hands. As I backed up the hill, the mining activity started to wane. The equipment and the lights were dimmed, grew quiet, and the laborers vanished back into the shadows. Nothing was there when I got to the top of the ridge and the valley, but the woodland seems deserted. Route 19. ALT had vanished. My vehicle was back on the ordinary roadway I should have been on the entire time, Interstate 77. My GPS indicated that I was precisely where, If I hadn't taken the diversion, I would have been. However, my clock indicated that I had lost 4 hours during those mountains. I arrived in Columbus 12 hours late, and I had no way to justify it. Provide my dispatcher with information that would avoid a psychological assessment and drug test. Here's what still keeps me up at night, though. Since then, every GPS device I've looked at displays Route 19 Alt as an actual road. At stops, I spoke with truckers who mentioned using the new route via West Virginia, which expedites Columbus runs. A few of them never reached their final destinations. The route is, however, continuing to gather Morrison men and perhaps others with ancestry in the mining business of Appalachia. It continues to promise time savings and shortcuts to drivers whose familial history is unknown. And occasionally late at night, I can hear them calling on the CB radio when I'm driving by myself. Jake Morrison, in an hour, your shift will begin. It's time to return home and work at the family business. Every family is remembered by the mountains that has ever tested their limits. Additionally, they never let their employees to fully retire. After 15 years of trail maintenance in these mountains, I believed I understood every route, risk, and peril. However, in October of last year, I learned that certain routes are self-maintained and do not desire human intervention. Following the events on Virginia's Section 12 of the Appalachian Trail, I, Tom Bradley, recognized that people are but visitors to these old mountains, and that some visitors linger too long. Since 2009, I have volunteered to maintain the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. Traversing a 20-mile stretch through central Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. Although it's solitary labor, I adore it. There's a great sense of fulfillment in maintaining these routes and able to accommodate the thousands of hikers who visit each year. I am familiar with every rock, road, and view along my designated area. I've removed fallen trees and put out innumerable fires, constructed water barricades to stop erosion following storms, and fixed damaged bridges. Although it is necessary, trail maintenance is not a glamorous job. In just a few seasons, these paths would be overgrown and hazardous if they weren't regularly maintained. Nature has a method. These of recovering the areas that people have carved out of the forest, and it is my responsibility to uphold the delicate equilibrium between access and preservation. Following a strong storm in October, this specific repair trip was planned. A no point had ravaged central Virginia. Significant damage had been reported to the Trail Conservancy along a number of portions: damaged fires, fallen trees obstructing the way, and at least one bridge that sudden flooding had swept out. I was tasked with evaluating and fixing a 5-meter stretch that was said to have struck hard. It was a clear Saturday morning as I drove up to the trailhead. My pickup truck is full with equipment, paint for reviving fires, and bridge building material, repairs, as well as adequate supplies for the lengthy weekend of work I anticipated. I had intended to camp at designated locations along the path because the damage reports had been so severe, rather than make the daily drive back and forth. However, I discovered an impossibility when I arrived at the first damage site that had been recorded. The trail was flawless, not just adequate, but spotless. The route was free of trash. The fires were new and luminous. Furthermore, the allegedly demolished bridge was not just intact, yet it appeared to have just been built. There was no discoloration on the wood. The fasteners were gleaming, and the whole building seemed as if it had been constructed in the last week. I remained there for a few minutes, looking at my maintenance maps and my GPS coordinates. Undoubtedly, this was the ideal spot. The path exhibited no signs of recent storm damage, despite the fact that I had worked this section for years and knew every landmark. As I hiked on to look at the other damage areas that had been recorded, but I came upon the same thing. Each downed tree had been cleared. Each part that had been wiped out had been restored, and new fires had mathematically indicated the path. I had been beaten to the maintenance task. However, who? The Trail Conservancy follows rigorous timetables and procedures. I would have been informed if my part had been assigned to another volunteer. No experts are present, maintenance teams operating disorganized, and the job I observed was too complex and expert to be the outcome of hikers with good intentions picking up after themselves. I became aware of the tools at that point. At the third fixed location, I discovered an entire collection of trail maintenance tools perfectly aligned next to the path. Brush paintbrushes, pruning shears, scissors, and measuring instruments, all arranged together military accuracy. Some of the instruments had designs I had never seen before, and they were old but in perfect condition. Antique equipment with no traces of age or wear that appeared to have been constructed decades ago. I yelled, believing that there might be another maintainer working nearby. "Hi there. Is there anyone present? Are these your instruments?" My voice reverberated. You off the ridges around it, but no one answered. It was hauntingly silent in the jungle. No sounds of birds, no rustling of tiny creatures, a deafening quiet, and no wind rustling through the trees that caused me to become extremely conscious of every sound I was producing. I made the decision to carry out my planned maintenance check. However, I took pictures of the enigmatic instruments and their exact placement. The scene had a purposeful feel about it, choreographed, as if it were a message I was expected to comprehend. While I ventured more into my designated part, I started to notice further irregularities. There were blazes in places that weren't scheduled for maintenance. Trees with no blazes should have perfect white rectangles painted on them. A few led off the designated path in the direction of what looked like unexplored detours. The most unsettling were the footprints. I discovered boot prints in muddy areas of the route that came and went in an erratic way. A series of prints would abruptly stop in the middle of a trip, as though the creator had just disappeared. As though someone had suddenly appeared in the center of the path. More tracks appeared out of nowhere. A single person was suggested by the print's uniform tread pattern and size. However, the distance between steps was incorrect. Sometimes they are too near to one another, and other times they are too far apart, as if the person who made them didn't move in the typical ways that people do. By the end of the afternoon, I was actually thinking about calling off the maintenance trip. It seemed terrible in every way, and my 15 years of experiences in the bush were blaring warnings. However, after 4 hours of driving, I still had valid maintenance duties to finish. I camped 10 miles away at a predetermined location, entering the area. As night fell, I made an effort to persuade myself that there, a rational explanation for all I had seen. It's possible that another volunteer misunderstood the duties. Perhaps, a few of the damage reports were either misplaced or overstated. However, I heard them working at midnight. Through the forest, the noises of trail maintenance could be heard. The steady thud of wood being chopped. The scraping of instruments versus stone. The sound of brush being raked out. The noises arrived from every angle, as though a whole team was laboring across the woodland. I picked up my headlamp and made my way to the closest noises. However, after I departed from my camping, everything went quiet. I searched the nearby forest with my light beam, but I couldn't find anything, aside from shadows and trees. My own tools had been moved when I got back to camp. They were set up and, as though someone were pointing, the exact line I had previously found was spread out next to my tent. The following. When I woke up in the morning, I saw that my trail segment had changed during the night. I had never seen routes marked by new blazes. Previously, intricate wooden bridges crossed gullies that had not been there the day before. There were stone steps etched into mathematically precise steep portions. The piece was stunning, yet unachievable. The type of building that a skilled staff would need weeks to finish. All of this caused hikers to depart from the well-established. In the deep forest, the Appalachian Trail leads to uncharted territory. I was standing there looking at one of the new bridges. Behind me, I heard a voice. "This is not where you should be." I turned around and discovered that I was dealing with something that was obviously no longer human, but might have been in the past. Tall and slender, it wore clothing that was composed of materials I didn't recognize but appeared to have been made for trail labor. Its eyes were the deep green of forest shadows, and its gray, aged skin looked like ancient bark. "This is my section," I murmured, struggling to maintain a steady tone. These paths have been under my care for 15 years. It slanted its head, looking at me with what may have been interest. These trails predate your species. Before your ancestors ever considered crossing the ocean, they were molded by creatures who were familiar with the mountains. We keep them up for reasons you can't comprehend. A public trail is the Appalachian Trail. Resource: people rely on appropriate upkeep for their safety, I remarked. The thing laughed like a breeze across parched leaves. Where we let your people walk, to take a stroll. What we decide to show them is what they see. The pathways you believe you keep are actually shadows of the ones you actually keep, that pass through these mountains. It pointed to the bridges and fires that had sprung up throughout the night. These resulted into locations not displayed on your maps. Locations where time passes in a different way. Where the mountains recall their former selves before being ravaged by your civilization. I answered, I just want to do my job. I'd like to maintain the safety of the trail, then demonstrate that you comprehend the true meaning of that. The task was easy but daunting. I was required to stay for 3 days and nights, pursuing the new fires set by the entity, preserving the enigmatic paths that went into uncharted territory, and prove that I was capable of working with whatever intellect controlled these mountains. The paths I revealed to me areas of the Appalachian that are not included in any topographical survey over those 3 days. I kept up bridges that crossed impossibly deep canyons and paved roads that passed through woods where trees were older than the arrival of Europeans, and new fires that indicated paths to locations that seemed real outside of everyday existence. The thing observed me at work, assessing my technique, my regard for the natural world, my realization that I was a visitor to something far bigger and more ancient than human society. I was camping next to a stream on the 3rd night. It whispered to me once more, flowing uphill and reflecting stars I didn't identify. You are free to carry on working, but please remember that you are working with our consent and not by default. The mountains, when they approve of your intentions, they will direct your efforts. As I made my way back to my truck, the enigmatic paths had disappeared. My portion of the Appalachian Trail appeared to be well maintained and in perfect condition, although not impossible perfection. Back in my truck, my tools were set up just the way I'd packaged them. Although I continue to keep up the roots in these mountains, I now ask initial authorization. Before I start working, I whisper to the nature, explaining what and why I intend to do it. I occasionally discover that maintenance activities are finished themselves overnight, when my efforts are rewarded by the mountains. At other times, I found that the repairs I've made have been changed in subtle ways for reasons I don't entirely comprehend. The mountains. Now that I'm working, I realize that I'm only there because they let me. I've discovered that maintaining trails is not about forcing one's will on the wilderness. The goal is to bargain with intelligence that is far older and more sophisticated than our species, and we hope that our tiny efforts to maintain these routes are in line with whatever higher goal directs the historic paths throughout Appalachia's interior. Certain routes were sculpted by forces we don't comprehend, therefore the most we can do is treat them with dignity and modesty. For 3 summers, I stood guard over thousands of acres as a fire lookout from a tower that was meant to be abandoned. However, I wasn't alone up there, and my dreams are constantly plagued by what I saw through those binoculars. Chris is my name. Since I've seen job advertisements for the identical fire tower position, Morgan and I must share this story. Allow a fellow college student to make the same error that I did. I was 21 years old and was in dire need of a summer job that would pay enough to pay for my tuition for my senior year. The majority of my pals were employed, employment in restaurants or retail, earning just above minimum pay, when I came upon a job opening that looked too good to be true on the university's job board. Fire lookouts for isolated towers in the Appalachian Mountains were being hired by the North Carolina Forest Service, paying twice as much as summer employment normally do. The role was precisely what I required: good compensation, solitary occupation that would allow me to study during calm times, the kind of privacy that was appealing to someone who had been putting up with noisy housemates and packed dorms for 3 years. I'd always been at ease by myself, assured of my capacity to manage crises and the task. It sounded like paid camping with obligations based on the description. The interview was short and strange, informal. Henderson, a seasoned Forest Service supervisor, appeared to more intrigued by my personality than by my credentials. He kept asking me if I felt at ease with isolation, whether I was familiar with radio equipment, and if I would ever encountered strange occurrences in wilderness environments. A few of our towers are located in extremely distant areas, he clarified. Lookouts may not see another person for weeks at a time. Some people are more affected by isolation than others. Someone who can manage the psychological strain is what we need. He allocated I was sent to T-Tower 47, which is situated atop a hilltop in the Pisgah National Forest, and needed a hike of 4 hours. Constructed in the 1940s, the tower had been deactivated in 1987 as a result of increased airplane surveillance more efficient than human observation. Henderson clarified, though, that recent budget constraints had compelled them to reactivate a number of distant towers to save money. The ascent to Tower, although exhausting, 47 was stunning. The switch on the trail backed up steeply. Landscape, moving through several ecosystems as I ascended higher. By the eye was excited but fatigued when I arrived at the tower. It was a traditional fire lookout building. A little cabin positioned with windows on all sides on steel legs, around 60 feet above the forest floor. Sides that provide sweeping views of the surrounding forest. However, when ascending the cabin's steps, I discovered something that unnerved me. The items from the prior lookout were still there: clothing, personal belongings, even food in the tiny fridge. On the desk next to the radio was a coffee mug, 3/4 full with moldy fluids that had been there for a while. The logbook revealed the most recent entry was made on August 15, 1987. Day 73. Unusual lights in Sector 7 once more. Sending a dispatch report. The weather is clear and visibility is good. Something is undoubtedly out there. Mere Patterson. The date of that entry was only 3 days prior to. It was said that the tower had been deactivated. I attempted to call my boss on the radio to inquire about the prior lookout's possessions, but I received an odd response. The voice that responded wasn't owned by Henderson. I couldn't identify the woman's accent. She also didn't seem to know which tower I was in, calling from. Tower 47. Honey, it has been closed for decades. Are you sure? I take it. You're reading your coordinates? I maintained that I was in Tower 47 and that I had been formally. She put me on hold after assigning me there. A few minutes later, Henderson's voice emerged from the static. Please disregard the earlier lookout material. Patterson was strange. Keep your attention on your work and report any fire activity you come across. The initial week went by without any problems. I developed a pattern. The weather in the morning, observations, radio check-ins, and hourly binocular forest sweeps with nighttime reporting and dispatch. In peaceful times, I prepared for my approaching senior year and relished the amazing seclusion of being by yourself above the canopy of the forest. However, I saw things that didn't make sense via the binoculars. Where roads, paths, and human access were lacking, I would watch motion that appeared to be humans strolling through a woodland. They ignored the natural flow and proceeded in straight lines, shapes of the landscape, and they moved at speeds that appeared unattainable for anyone walking. They would just disappear as if they had never been there, even if you tried to follow them with the binoculars. The radio, the chats were even more unsettling. During regular dispatch check-ins, other voices would occasionally burst in, lookouts reporting from previously demolished skyscrapers years in the past. They described the weather and fire activity in cool, businesslike tones, as though they remained on duty. Tower 23 will be sent out, 8 miles in the distance. The wind coming from the southwest at 15 knots. Sector 12 is experiencing unusual fire activity, but it's not spreading in a typical manner. Against the wind, the flames are going upward. Tower 8 reporting. Day 127 of non-stop work. There is still no scheduled relief. The observers are approaching the base of the tower in the forest. Ask for a backup right now. I questioned Henderson about these. He said I was picking up old records of transmissions, a widespread radio echo phenomena in mountainous areas terrain, but the discussions were too real-time and participatory to be recorded. After 10 days in the tower, I found a secret room. There was a small door in the main cabin behind a bookshelf that I had somehow overlooked during my preliminary investigation. The space beyond was crammed with decades worth of surveillance gear, including cameras with enormous recording equipment, telephoto lenses, and hundreds of photos capturing things that shouldn't be there. The pictures displayed in far more detail the same figures I had been looking at via binoculars, tall, slender creatures that moved with an unearthly grace across the jungle. Some seemed to be standing and observing the tower itself. For hours, they remained still at the edge of the woodland. One picture made me bleed. Run chilly. It displayed a view of Tower 47's interior from outside the cabin. Windows. I could see myself dozing off in the tiny cot in the picture, but one of the tall creatures was standing next to me, looking over my bed as though observing me. The picture had a date on it, 2 evenings prior. I realized then that Tower 47 had never been decommissioned. It had been transformed into a monitoring observation post. Paranormal activity in the area. No fires were being monitored by the Forest Service. They were keeping an eye out for something else. As I looked at the pictures, the radio sounded. However, it wasn't dispatch or another lookout this time. Something else was involved. Something that had been hearing everything I sent. "Look out, Morgan. Good evening. We have been observing you as you observe us. It is time for us to talk." I whirled to locate one of the tall. There were figures in the concealed room's entryway. At close range, it was clearly not human. It was out of proportion. Too tall, slender, and having joints that twisted in ways that were contrary to anatomy. Its gray face was a flawless expanse, skin with animal-like eyes that reflected light. "You are performing the same duties as it said, your predecessors," as if speaking from inside my thoughts instead of my ears, and it watched. The forest, making notes and reporting irregularities. "The sole distinction is that you're still not sure what you're actually seeing. I retreated into the main cabin and said, 'College student, my stay here is limited to the summer.' Patterson believed that he was just working as well. He was preceded by Thompson and Ann Richardson. The truth was revealed to them all. Finally, the tower exists to keep an eye on the line separating your world from ours. The watchers must be watched by someone." It pointed to the surveillance apparatus. "We exist even though your race only perceives 3 dimensions. In multiple. The location of the tower makes it possible to see dimensional intrusions that pose a threat to both of our realms. The prior lookouts were aware of their true mission. They decided to remain. Remain? What became of them? They are still present, continuing to observe and report. The position never stops. Morgan, take heed. Permanent observers who know what they're actually viewing are needed on the mountains." Our voices could now be heard over the radio. They all checked in from towers that existed in dimensions, i.e., dozens of them. Couldn't see. Previous lookouts who reported on things that moved and fires that burnt in the space between worlds, on weather patterns that existed in the gaps between ideas. Through forests of probability. "You are welcome to participate," the creature went on. "Them. Alternatively, you can depart and live your entire life with the knowledge that the boundary is undefended, that your world will gradually infiltrate ours, and that invasions will go unnoticed till the difference is irrelevant. I considered my everyday existence, I considered my future goals and my final year of college, but I also considered the duty I had unwittingly taken on. When I accepted this position, if the tower was indeed keeping an eye on dangers to both realities, leaving it could have repercussions I couldn't have predicted. I recall my emergency procedures training at that point. Each lookout carries a satellite beacon in case of an emergency. I sent a distress signal after activating mine. Signal to the Forest Service headquarters, but I received an unfeasible response. The rescue crew said they were unable to find Tower 47. In line with their records, the Pisa National Forest did not have such a structure. The coordinates that I displayed just a desolate wasteland. The thing observed me with potential been amused. The tower is interdimensional. Morgan, take heed. There is just one in which your rescue crew works. Unless you decide to go back to their reality, they can't get to you. For 3 days I stay put, filing reports and keeping an eye on the forest as I try to figure out how to get out of I had stepped into an interdimensional trap. I wasn't threatened by the creature, but it made it apparent that leaving would mean quitting my job and possibly putting both worlds in peril. Couldn't understand. Something changed during a brief thunderstorm on the 4th day. It appeared that the lightning grounded the tower back to everyday life. And for a little while I was able to observe the forest in its true state, free of the dimensional overlays, devoid of the impossible topography and the viewers. Rappelling down the outside of the tower as quickly as I could, I snatched up my rucksack and headed for the steps. Behind me, in addition to the voices of all the earlier lookouts who had decided to call my name, I could hear the thing remain. As soon as the storm passed and the tower started to revert to its interdimensional state, I arrived at the trail. Pay state. Without turning around, I dashed down the mountain, continuing till I arrived at the trailhead at my car. I discovered that Tower 47 had been taken down when I attempted to report what had occurred. From every official document, there was no record of my employment with the Forest Service. No records of the location or awareness of any fire towers that have been reactivated in the area. I never worked as a fire lookout again, yet occasionally I still hear the radio calls. Previous lookouts checking in, reporting fires that burn in areas that are invisible to us, keeping an eye out for intrusions that jeopardize the world-to-world boundary. Someone must keep watch since the mountains are always watching. However, I made the decision to just exist in one dimension, even if it meant not finishing the task. Some towers are intended to remain abandoned because responsibilities are too much for a college student to handle. Consider your options carefully if you come across a job posting for a fire lookout that pays too high and requires too little expertise. Submitting an application. Though they prefer those who never ask to return home, the mountains need guards. I'm telling this tale because I want people to realize that some underground locations should never be investigated, regardless of your perceived level of experience. I fell 6 months ago into a cave system that is not listed on any geological surveys in eastern Kentucky. Furthermore, I'm still unsure if I ever returned to the surface. Rebecca Martinez is my name, and I was formerly an expert in spelunking. Formerly because of what I discovered deep within the Daniel Boone National. I can hear voices calling from the shadows below when I gaze at cave entrances, forest. I have been investigating caverns for 12 years, ever since I became interested in the sport while studying geology in graduate school. There's something incredibly fulfilling about exploring tunnels and being the first to spot formations that have spent millions of years growing in the dark. Throughout the Southeast, I have investigated cave systems, from the technical difficulties of Alabama's deepest shafts to the enormous chambers of Mammoth Cave. I have a cave certification for Nsema Rescue. I never cave by myself, and I always have the right gear. Those are the guidelines that sustain splunkers. However, I disregarded my own rules this time. I was researching the geology of vehicles for my doctoral dissertation in Kentucky when I learned about the cave system from Jimmy Caldwell, a local. I had been speaking with longtime locals regarding historical use of caves, including how they were stored by previous generations, sanctuary, and occasionally less lawful activities throughout the Prohibition era. Jimmy was as sharp as an arrow, in his 80s, and more knowledgeable than anyone I'd encountered on the subsurface geography of the area. There's at a Hazard Cafe, he told me over coffee. There's a cave system up on Bent Creek Ridge that ain't on any of your maps. I haven't been back since my father showed me it when I was a youngster. Something about that place just ain't right. outlined a cave entrance that is only accessible during dry spells and is concealed behind a waterfall, seasons during which the water level fell. The gateway opened into a vast network of chambers that stretched for miles, subterranean, featuring passageways that linked to other cave networks across the area. However, Jimmy's explanation was ambiguous, apparently on purpose, as though he didn't want to give too much information. "Why does it not have a map?" I inquired. A system of that size ought to have thorough documentation." Jimmy's face grew serious. "Miss, there are some things that are better left alone. When his grandfather was a boy, my father informed me the cave was old, said that it was a location where creatures go to die, however occasionally they don't stay dead. I ought to have followed his advice, but I was too ecstatic about the prospect of finding an uncharted cave system. Discovering Virgin Passage is the ultimate goal, sure of spelunking, and it has significant scholarly ramifications for my study. I persuaded Jimmy to give me instructions to the door, but he declined to give me a personal tour. Bent Creek Ridge hike took the most of a morning traversing terrain that revealed game pathways and creek beds, no indications of human passing. Jimmy had described a waterfall, and that was just where he had stated that it would be. A 40-foot waterfall that plunges into a deep pool encircled by limestone cliffs, however, because of the high water level and the cave's mouth, fully submerged. I camped nearby and waited 2 weeks for a dry spell to bring the water level down. While I waited, recording the surface geology. At last the cascade dwindled to a trickle, and I could see the cave entrance is a shadowy, roughly 6 foot high by 4 foot wide aperture behind the falls. I chose to conduct my first reconnaissance alone, defying every safety precaution I had ever been taught. I informed myself that I was just going to look at the entrance and perhaps go around the first chamber to see whether it was worth sending a whole crew. I possessed emergency communications equipment, several light sources, and complete technical gear. What might go wrong? After about 50 feet of a low crawl, the entrance passage opened onto a room that astounded me. The headlamp beam vanished into the shadows above and to either side, suggesting an area bigger than the majority of the area's known caves. The walls were coated with, the floor was covered in flowstone formations that glistened in my light like crystals, smooth limestone sculpted by the flow of ancient water. However, what first caught my attention was the quiet. The sound of pouring water typically reverberates across cave systems, the murmurs of moving rock, the faint creaks, and the flutter of bat wings. This cave was utterly silent, as though the ground itself were holding its breath. I put up my equipment and started taking measurements and pictures of the chamber. The area was approximately round, roughly 200 feet across, with passageways branching off in several instructions. Some were spacious enough for comfortable walking. Others were close quarters that would need crawling. I then became aware of the bones strewn all over the chamber floor. Were bones. In addition to animal bones, human femurs and skulls, combined with the carcasses of bears, deer, and other woodland animals. The ancient bones were whitened by mineral deposits in time, yet they were grouped in ways that implied intentional placement as opposed to organic accumulation. I was taking pictures of one. When I heard the first voice, the arrangement seemed especially big. "My name is Rebecca." From somewhere further down the cave system, the words were clear. It was a female voice. I couldn't place it, but it seemed familiar. In answer, I called out, but my voice seemed to multiply, to distort, and then to fade into quiet as it echoed weirdly in the large chamber. "Go deeper, Rebecca." We'd been holding out. I recognized the voice this time. It was Maria, my sister, who passed away 3 years prior in a car accident. However, that was not feasible. Maria was never a cave, hadn't even been to Kentucky. I attempted to persuade myself it was phenomenon related to sound. Perhaps sounds that approximated human speech were produced by wind flowing through the tunnels. However, as they explored further, the voices become more regular and clear. Dr. Peterson, my graduate advisor, called from a corridor to my left, the name. From someplace above, my childhood buddy Sarah whispered encouragement. Even my grandma, who passed away when I was 12, encouraged me to keep researching in order to discover what was most deeply rooms. They were all individuals who I had lost, mourned, and I could know their voices anywhere. I ought to have gone back. Each and every 12-year-old caver's instinct was screaming warnings. However, the voices were incredibly friendly, warm, and they were pointing me in the direction of findings that would transform the field of cave science. I went farther into the longest section of the system, using the voices to guide them. The route had a constant slope, dropping, and I could see from my depth sensor that I was going well below the water table. Around me, the shapes turned into more complex, massive stalactites, cascades of flowstone, and I have never seen crystal formations like these before. Following what seemed like hours I walked into a room that was inexplicable from a geological perspective. The area was enormous, perhaps the size of a football stadium, with a ceiling that was obscured by the darkness. However, the impossibility was the source of light. The walls themselves were glowing softly with phosphorescence, plenty bright to see without my headlamp. Dozens of individuals were seated in the chamber, all of them meditative positions on the polished limestone surface. They dressed in apparel from various periods. While some were dressed in decades-old clothing, others were wearing hiking gear from today. A few were dressed in such antiquated attire that they resembled historical museum clothes. As I walked in, I noticed a mix of familiar faces and unfamiliar ones, and they all turned to stare at me. Maria was present, seeming just as she had prior to the mishap. Beside her, Dr. Peterson wore the same field clothing in which he perished 2 years prior during a cave-in. From the other side of the room, my grandmother grinned at me, unaltered by the years that have passed since her passing. "Rebecca, welcome home," Maria replied, getting up and approaching me. "You've been looking for us for a long time." "This isn't real," I said, retreating in the direction of the passageway. "You've passed away. All of you are dead." "Death is," my grandmother remarked softly, "just another passage, like the caves you love to explore." The deepest chamber was located. The last chamber, where every channel comes together. Dr. Peterson got up and came over to me, his face gentle. "Yet, Rebecca, it's been weird. The cave system predates human civilization. Every person who genuinely enjoys the subterranean eventually finds their way here. I have been gathering explorers for millennia. Noticed that some of the seated figures in the room weren't human at all. They were older, more primitive, exhibiting bone characteristics that indicated they had existed in this cave before the evolution of modern people. "You can stay," said explorers from species that had disappeared from the surface world. Maria took my hand and whispered, "No more searching, no more loneliness, just the continuous investigation of the transitional periods between life and death." The warmth, I had never felt anything like the genuineness of her touch since she passed away. The desire to remain and participate, the never-ending assembly of adventurers, was astounding. However, my apparatus was still continuing to work, continued to record data, and continued to stay connected to the outside world. My beacon of emergency was giving cave rescue crews my GPS coordinates so they could search for me if I didn't return on time. I sprinted toward the passage entrance after turning on my emergency locator. Behind me, the voices rose in unison, dissatisfied that I was making this decision rather than outraged. The isolation of the surface compared to the depths community. The section that had led me into the room was gone. It was replaced with dozens of openings that promised to take me in various ways. Farther down in the ground, the system of caves was changing, adapting to stop me from going. I followed the lifeline I had set up on my way down, my rappelling rope. However, the rope took me through tunnels that contradicted the local geology and into passageways I had never seen before. Time passed. In the dark, oddly. I had been underground for 3 hours, according to my watch. However, it seemed like days. At last, fatigued and confused, I noticed a natural light up ahead. Desperate to find the opening behind it, I crawled toward it. The cascade. Rather, I came out of a cave entrance that I had never seen before, miles away in an unfamiliar valley from where I had entered. My GPS device displayed coordinates that aren't possible. The equipment indicated that I was at an area that should have been hundreds of feet of solid rock, subterranean, but I was unquestionably on the surface, standing next to a watercourse I had never seen on any map of the topography. After 2 days of hiking, I came across a route that brought me to civilization. I attempted to report the cave system to geological authorities. I found that no survey included the region one had described. The Bent Creek Ridge's waterfall was classified as a modest seasonal flow without any related cave systems. I couldn't find, once more, Jimmy Caldwell. No one by that name had ever been employed by the diner where we had met, and none of the I spoke with locals who recalled him. Following that encounter, I ceased caving. I sold everything I owned, gave up on my dissertation, and accepted a position teaching geology in a landlocked high school, state lacking any noteworthy cave systems. However, I can still hear their calls. On Silent at Night, I can hear Maria's voice coming from subway tunnels and storm drains, from underground parking garages and basements. She and Doctor are still waiting in that phosphorescent chamber. My grandma, Peterson, and every other explorer who stayed. We don't fully comprehend how large and interconnected the underground world is. Each cave system is merely a gateway to the more extensive network. The timeless sections where those who genuinely enjoy the dark eventually find a place to call home. I went with the surface, but a piece of me remains there, continuing to explore and follow the voices that assure me of the next chamber around the next curve in the path holds the final discovery. The section. Every person who has ever stepped into the Earth's depths, and some calls to investigate are more difficult to decline than others. Families deserve to know the truth about what transpired with their loved ones under these circumstances, which is why I am sharing my tale. Mountains. I served on the Appalachian Search and Rescue Team for 8 years. I also believed I had witnessed every possible manner the wilderness might take a human life. However, in September, I learned that some people are abducted rather than disappearing. My name is Lisa Hartwell, and I've learned from my investigation into the Morrison family that the goal of a rescue effort is to succeed. I obtained my search and rescue certification. Volunteer when my brother got lost while hiking with his college class in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was located following 36 hours, alive but hypothermic and dehydrated. The SAR squad that came to his rescue motivated me to pursue wilderness rescue training, and I've been answering calls across the eastern Tennessee and North Carolina. Search and rescue operations are systematic, scientific. We make use of probability maps that are dependent on weather and topography. Coordinate with helicopter crews, send out specialized search dogs, and follow created procedures that have prevented thousands of deaths. We are aware that most people are discovered, injured individuals seek refuge, and hikers usually pursue water sources downhill, if they are to be discovered alive, within the first 72 hours. However, the Morrison case defied every regulation. On a Tuesday morning in late September, a call was received. Karen Morrison and David Morrison, both seasoned hikers in their 50s, had not returned from a 3-day planned camping excursion in the National Forest of Pisgah. When they failed to check in at the appointed time, their daughter reported them missing. Monday night. Model hikers were the Morrisons. They had been trekking the Appalachian Mountains for more than 20 years, had the appropriate equipment, and had an itinerary with the ranger station. Years. They intended to follow a well-traveled circle trail that they had already done several times. These weren't unskilled travelers who had strayed from designated routes. On Wednesday, our group gathered at the trailhead. Good morning. A helicopter is on standby, along with 12 volunteers and 2 search dogs. The climate had been ideal for the time they had set aside for hiking. No precipitation, warm temperatures, and clear skies. The circumstances were favorable for a fruitful search. We began by doing as they had planned. Path, keeping an eye out for any indications that the intended course has changed. Everything for the first 8 miles seems to be normal. As proof of their passage, we discovered a granola bar wrapper in their distinctive location, boot prints that matched their equipment in wet trail parts, and even a picture they had shot at based on the timestamp of a camera they dropped. A picturesque view. However, at marker 12, their trail just disappeared. We had been following the boot prints just came to a halt in the middle of the path. Not slowly, not since they had shifted to rough ground where footprints would be more difficult to identify, but suddenly, as though David and Karen Morrison had just, in mid-ride, it stopped existing. Tom remarked, "This doesn't make sense." Our team leader, Bradley, has 15 years of SAR experience. Individuals don't simply vanish. There has been to serve as an explanation. Assuming they had strayed from the main track for some reason, we broadened our search pattern. Cause. However, our search dogs, German shepherds with extensive training and hundreds of successful rescues under their belts, was unable to detect any scent trail past the point at which the traces vanished. I became aware of the cameras at that point. Mounted on trees spaced about 8 feet apart and dispersed around the woodland were tiny telephoto lens digital cameras. They were in a position to offer establishing a thorough surveillance network with overlapping coverage of the whole region. The cameras were resistant to weather and seemed to be solar-powered, indicating that it will be installed permanently. I yelled out to Tom, "Do you see these cameras? This location is being watched." However, nothing was visible when Tom and the other team members arrived to take a look. They claimed that I was aiming at trees that are vacant. I was the only one who could see the cameras. I made an effort to persuade. For me, it was a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many challenging searches and insufficient sleep. However, the cameras were too precise and reliable to be my creation. I was able to read serial numbers, activate the apparatus, and observe LED indicators that demonstrate active recording. On we located the first Morrison campground on the second search day. It was precisely where their itinerary said it would be. It ought to be configured in accordance with their typical routines. However, there was a basic problem with the scene. The tent was staked correctly, the instructions were followed, and it was pitched flawlessly. Their equipment was meticulously planned for military purposes, folding and packing clothing, trekking and cleaning, and storing cooking equipment boots positioned next to each other at the entrance to the tent. It appeared to be an advertisement for camping gear rather than a location where actual people had slept. However, there were no scuff marks in the dirt or indications of human habitation. No coffee marks, no food crumbs, no bent grass where people had trod. It was as though the campsite had been put together by someone who was familiar with the Morrisons' camping style but had never seen. Outdoor equipment is used by people. I informed Tom, "This is staged." While taking pictures of the campsite is uncannily ideal. This was set up to make it appear as though the Morrisons were present, but they never use it. Equipment. Tom took a close look at the location but didn't agree. "Everything, Lisa." That seems typical to me. Perhaps they are simply exceptionally tidy campers. The search dogs. Both animals, which are often willing to work and obedient to orders, sat at the campsite but refused to enter. Perimeter, howling and retreating from the tent. When their owners attempted to compel them to come nearer, the dogs turned into upset and attempted to turn back toward the main trail. That evening, as our group made, I initially heard the voices when I was camping about a mile from the Morrison site. "Lisa, please assist us. Karen Morrisons were trapped." A distinct, urgent voice is coming from the direction of their deserted encampment, keeping us here. The woodland was totally quiet as I woke up Tom and the other team members. Quiet, save for the typical sounds of distant owl calls and wind through trees, but I could hear the Morrisons identifying a position that didn't correspond with any terrain feature on our topographical charts, and blatantly requesting rescue. Karen's voice said, "The cameras are watching us, and they're somewhere between the mapped area and somewhere else. We are unable to leave the observers." On the third day, after hearing instead of following conventional search procedures, I found myself hiking by myself in the direction of a location that seemed to be unknown. The topography was incorrect according to official maps. It was overly steep and heavily forested. Rock formations that were inconsistent with the local geology. The cameras were now installed everywhere, not only on trees but arising from the earth, developing from the sides of rocks and incorporated into the actual terrain. They mechanically followed my movements and the lenses changed focus to keep it clear. As I went by, I came to the actual Morrison campsite, tucked away in a mountains that climbed unnaturally high, encircling a valley that shouldn't be there. A campsite above the forest canopy appeared to be just what I would anticipate from two seasoned hikers. A fire ring with cold ashes, hiking boots that kicked off, and natural scattering idly next to a tent that was clearly in use. Yet David and Karen Morrison was absent, replaced by two figures that appeared to be elaborate mannequins placed in. They wore the Morrisons' clothing and struck hiking stances, but they were clearly fake. Had their identity on them, but their faces lacked features. "The search is over," one said, turning to face me with empty eye sockets that had contained small camera lenses. "We've been found safe and sound," Karen Morrison continued. "Please tell our family we're continuing our hike and we'll be in contact shortly." I realized what had transpired at that point. Morrisons had been gathered, not lost, and someone was using the wilderness as a test site, monitoring human behavior using a vast network of cameras. And the mannequins served as stand-ins, and people were periodically taken for more in-depth research. Intended to give search and rescue efforts closure, but the actual Morrisons were detained somewhere. I was unable to see the staged campsite our crew had discovered, because it was a part of the trick intended to comply with SAR procedures and conclude the search without. The truth is out. "Where are they? Where are the real Morrisons?" I demanded. "They are being researched." The mannequins' mechanically precise head tilts, their hiking habits, their gear selections, their stress-induced decision-making procedures, and the information is useful for comprehending how people behave in the woods. Release them. You can join them if you want, although the study is not yet finished. Your search and rescue background would be a helpful starting point. Data for comparison. I ignored it and ran, crashing into the impossibly dense trees. I could hear the mannequins after me, and the camera lenses behind me recorded my movements from every tree and rock. Their movements were too fluid for artificial joints, and I followed them at human speed. My GPS back toward the main route, but the satellite indicated that the coordinates were not possible. Data. I was at the initial search location and 30 meters away in territory that was not depicted on any map. Upon arriving at our base camp, I discovered Tom and the other members of S-Packing Equipment. They claim that the Morrisons were safely located after the successful search, and they decided to carry on with their trekking adventure, rather than go back right away. However, I requested that I see mannequins. People you found weren't human. Tom gave me a worried glance. "Lisa, you've been through a lot." I tried to show them the pictures I had taken of the cameras, but perhaps you should take a break from SR work. The artificial Morrisons and the impossible valley, but my camera only captured typical forest landscapes, trees, boulders, and deserted paths. The proof of the surveillance network had either been removed or never existed. According to the official report, David and Karen Morrison had been found uninjured and had refused rescue help, opting instead to finish their organized hiking schedule. The case was closed and the operation was successful, but I am aware of the truth. The Morrisons are still out there, somewhere between the locations the cameras view and the mapped world, being examined by a mind that is enough adept at human behavior to produce flawless mannequins, yet doesn't comprehend why we would forego safety and sleep in order to look for lost people. I quit the S. I couldn't keep acting like every missing person case had a typical explanation after that operation. I was aware that some people are abducted for reasons we cannot understand, yet I continue to track instances of missing persons from the Appalachian region, as well as the identities of seasoned hikers who go completely, leaving behind improvised campsites and impractical proof, families that accept illogical explanations because they are more in need of closure than they need the truth. The surveillance network, which covers thousands of square miles, is still in place. Most isolated mountainous areas, and occasionally when seasoned hikers fail to return from carefully thought-out excursions, I'm positive they haven't lost their way. Been chosen for research by an entity that considers human behavior in wilderness areas as information to be gathered. The Appalachian. We are the subjects of a laboratory in the mountains, and the majority of us are. Some are retained for more thorough analysis, while others are permitted to resume their regular lives. Although search and rescue personnel make every effort to locate the missing, we are unable to save those who have been taken outside of. Our maps can only depict the world's borders. We are only able to record the meticulously arranged evidence that has been left behind, and provide families whose loved ones declined assistance in favor of hiking on. The mountains keep a close eye on everything that passes through their wilderness, and some of these observers fail to discern between observation and gathering. We believe we are in untamed areas, yet sometimes we are being explored by the wild places, and the cameras record every hiker. The monitoring network never stops recording, and the majority of the information is likely innocuous, only observing how people behave in their normal environments. But observers occasionally determine they require more investigation, and knowledgeable hikers like the Morrisons offer the ideal subjects. Since I couldn't bear to find people who aren't quite human anymore, I decided to give up looking, substituted by synthetic models intended to conclude inquiries and bring closure. Yet the cameras are still observing, continuing to record, and continuing to choose research subjects. The next time a loved one disappears keep in mind that not all searches result in rescue in the Appalachian wilderness. The missing occasionally remain missing because they are performing a different function in locations that are not included on our maps. Between the world we know and the one that observes us from the shadows, there are cameras. It may seem impossible what I'm about to tell you, but I urge people to realize that there are species in something is gathering these mountains that shouldn't be there. I was monitoring a population of black bears in the Great Smoky Mountains that I believed to be endangered months ago. Rather, I learned that there is a wildlife preserve in the Appalachians that is unlike any other in our scientific comprehension. I'm Dr. Sarah Chin, and I was formerly a wildlife. I used to be a biologist. But after what I discovered in those isolated valleys, I'm unable to examine animal traces without questioning which ones are those of species that reside someplace between our world and otherwise. I've been researching Appalachian animal populations for 8 years, concentrating on threatened and endangered animals around the area. I am an expert in tracking huge mammals, mountain lions, bears, elk, and the sporadic wolf sightings that officially doesn't exist in these mountains. I combine GPS collars, trail cameras, and conventional tracking techniques, technologies to track animal numbers and how they use their habitats. A grant-funded study of black bear populations in the most isolated areas was the research that made all the difference. The Great Smoky Mountains may be home to a hitherto unidentified bear subspecies, according to recent reports, so remote that they acquired distinctive traits. If verified, it would be an important conservation finding that might result in more important habitat regions being protected. The study area was a 15,000-acre wilderness area that could only be reached by helicopter or a 2-day trek through areas that are rarely visited by tourists. I was given adequate trail cameras and GPS, 2 months' worth of food, and a planned pickup date, apparatus to track the movement of animals in the region. The first week was just what I had anticipated from remote wildlife study. I recorded deer, wild boar, and other typical Appalachian fauna, raccoons, as well as a robust population of black bears that lacked any clear subspecies traits. The GPS data revealed usual territorial behavior, and my trail cameras recorded typical nightly activity patterns. For large mammals, however, I began discovering tracks that did not correspond to any species in my field during the second week. The first unusual traces were found close to a brook approximately 5 miles from my base camp. They resembled bear prints, although they were much bigger. Compared to any black bear I recorded, the stride length indicated claw marks that were far longer than usual, larger than the majority of grizzly bears, standing at least 8 feet tall, which weren't expected to be found in the southeast United States. I took pictures of the plaster cast prints, from a variety of perspectives, but nothing matched when I attempted to identify the species using wildlife databases. The closest, like the tracks of ancient cave bears I had seen in paleontology textbooks, although those creatures had been extinct for 20,000 years. In the days that followed, I discovered more impractical tracks, wolf tracks, dinner plate-sized cat prints that are not associated with any known feline species in North America, from creatures weighing more than 200 pounds. Bird droppings from an object with a wingspan that would necessitate an animal bigger than any raptor that is currently known. Even odd imagery was being captured by motion-activated cameras. Displayed creatures that were smarter than typical fauna and traveled across the jungle, that moved in formation, deer that only used their rear legs, and deer that had human-like posture with military accuracy, simultaneously altering course as though in response to unspoken orders, that produced aerial exhibitions by flying in precisely geometrical patterns, appear purposefully staged, but the most unsettling footage featured animals that appear to be observing the cameras themselves. A huge black bear would come up to a camera, closely examine it, then, as though it understood the technology, position itself to evade the motion sensor while still being visible in the frame. I was being purposefully photographed. I attempted to communicate with my research coordinator via radio to report the results, but even though my satellite phone's signal strength was full, it was unable to connect. My device's GPS coordinates displayed readings that were not possible. According to the gadgets, I was in places and the Great Smoky Mountains at the same time. That was not included in any topographical study. After a game, I found the collection facility. As I ascended a mountain in the direction of greater elevation, I noticed that I was staring down into a valley that shouldn't have existed, but the landscape was inappropriate for the area. It was too round, too flat, encircled by mountains that towered unnaturally above the woodland canopy, and there was a building in the middle of the valley that appeared to be a wildlife preserve and research facility. Laboratory. The valley floor was lined with enclosures, each of which contained creatures I had never seen before, some of which appeared to be evolutionary relics of ancient species, while some seemed to be hybrids that combined traits of several animals in ways that were not possible from a biological standpoint. I was able to identify several of the missing individuals in the bigger enclosures, them from accounts of missing persons I had seen. Researchers, hunters, and hikers who had vanished during the previous few years in the Appalachian wilderness. They moved using the same synchronized accuracy I'd seen in the trail camera footage, obeying unseen orders and keeping flawless formation while following set routes around their confines. They maintained a human appearance, but their eyes held. The creatures had the same vacuous intelligence I had observed. They knew, but my consciousness has been diverted to incomprehensible goals. Standing, there were people dressed in what appeared to be park ranger uniforms along the perimeter of the building. However, their proportions were a little off, and their motions were too fluid. Observed the enclosures with scientific curiosity, taking notes on what looked like clipboard-like gadgets from time to time, although one of them saw me, and the figure turned, appearing to be constructed from materials not seen in nature, very precisely toward my viewing point, and I discovered that I was staring at something that bore a human face like a mask. It had flawless features but no expression, and it's like an animal. Its eyes reflected light, and as it lifted a hand in what appeared to be a greeting, I could see that there were too many joints in its fingers. Dr. Eld, Chen, and its voice. We appreciate your acceptance of our invitation, which was transmitted flawlessly over the impossibly long distance. Finding appropriate specimens has been greatly aided by your research, and I discovered that my entire study has been planned. The 2-month seclusion, the rural location, and the grant funds. Everything had been planned to bring me here at the appropriate moment, so my trail cameras hadn't been recording the behavior of wildlife. They had been recording my behavior for a research on human behavior. Researchers. Similar to how we looked at animals, your proficiency in monitoring animals makes you're a perfect fit for our collection. The figure went on. We've been studying your approach. You know enough about animal behavior to recognize our preserve's beauty. Other researchers were seen. Wildlife, park rangers, and field biologists are currently housed in human enclosures. photographers who were incorporated into the collection of the facility. They walked in the same deliberate manner as the inconceivable creatures, according to unseen directives and preserving patterns. It fulfilled functions that are incomprehensible to us. The figure started to ascend the ridge toward my location, going more quickly than the steep terrain should have permitted. In the rear, further uniformed figures appeared from concealed locations all over the building. They had been observing me all along, letting me should watch how they operate before approaching. I took off running. I smashed through the jungle, leaving behind all of my research tools and making my way toward what I hoped would be my base camp. They were not sprinting, but they were still moving at the same steady speed behind me, as if they understood I couldn't get away. As I jogged, my GPS device displayed inconsistent readings, coordinates that put me in several different places at once. The actual woodland appeared to be changing, with trails that come and go to direct me away from possible escape routes. However, I recalled the essential wildlife tracking rule. Water sources are followed by animals. I disregarded my GPS and sought to locate the stream that went back to familiar area by following the sound of flowing water. After several hours, I was so tired and confused that I went into a hiking trail that had official Park Service fires. A very human park was located at the ranger station where the trail led. A ranger voiced alarm over a lone hiker coming out of a restricted wilderness regions without the required authorization. When I attempted to report the establishment, and I learned that my study grant had never existed when I looked through the missing persons collection. The university didn't have any record of financing my effort, and the Park Service had no documentation of the helicopter drop-off I recalled. Flight records. I left GPS devices and trail cameras in the forest, but they were never recovered. In spite of the fact that based on official documents I would never be subjected to Park Service personnel searches. Been given permission to carry out research in the field where I said I had been employed. However, the tracking abilities that helped me avoid recapture and made me valuable to that gathering facility. I now know how to spot the telltale symptoms of their surveillance, such as too coordinated animal behavior and tracking patterns. These allude to unattainable species and too convenient wildlife shooting possibilities. The assortment, the institution continues to function and collect material for uses that reside outside the realm of human scientific comprehension. I currently teach biology in a landlocked high school. State without any notable wilderness regions, yet occasionally I get jobs offers for jobs conducting animal study in isolated areas. Constantly financed by organizations that aren't quite real and need my specific kind of competence. There is a preserve in the Appalachian Mountains that gathers rare species. And among the rarest examples of all are human researchers. Something is being studied. Our research strategies, paying attention to our observational methodologies, and sometimes determining that our knowledge would be more useful as a component of their collection than as a standalone scholars. Although I decline to be displayed in their facilities, I am aware that they are still observing. Every environmental photo I see, every animal video I encounter, I constantly assess each animal footprint I come across to determine whether it symbolizes the synchronized performance or natural behavior of specimens that exist to show the beauty of scientific compilation. Every researcher who has ever examined the mountain's animals is remembered, and some studies are intended to attract researchers directly. We believe we're recording animal behavior, but occasionally the animals are recording humans for the benefit of intelligence that values scientific techniques sufficiently to desire its long-term preservation. If you have the chance to research endangered species in remote areas, particularly if the financing source is unclear and the period of isolation is lengthy, keep in mind that certain wildlife preserves aren't intended to release their returning specimens to the wild. Certain collections are intended to last forever, and certain scholars become into the most priceless displays of all. There are many animals in the highlands that shouldn't be there. Intelligence-driven. They protect everything they value because they have a greater understanding of conservation than humans do. And committed among the rarest species in their collection are researchers. We believed we were getting a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, half the usual price for a luxurious cabin in the Smoky Mountains. However, some Because no one ever leaves to complain about the accommodations, the places are inexpensive. I'm Emily, and the events of that anniversary weekend almost ruined our relationship and my sense of self. Of actuality, since the same rental listing keeps coming up, I feel compelled to share this experience. And I can't allow the same thing happens to other couples. Jake, my spouse, and I had been anticipating our 5th anniversary for months. We had had enough of demanding tasks and limited budgets for years, set aside for a romantic vacation. We desired something unique, a location where we might get back in touch without the interruptions of daily life. When we came across the luxury cabin offering it was too good to be true, the Great Smoky Mountains. The images displayed a beautiful log cabin with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking foggy valleys, a stone hut, and a mountainside location. A wraparound deck with a hot tub and a fireplace. According to the description, contemporary conveniences, full hiking trails just outside the door, as well as seclusion. However, the cost was startlingly low, less than half the price of comparable houses. It was a strangely bare webpage. No business name, no phone number, only a basic booking form and an email address. There were none reviews, indicating that it had just been added to the list. The property was explained. NEA is Whispering Pines Retreat, and the images appeared expertly taken. Thus, we didn't hesitate to make the reservation. The email confirmation was short. We appreciate you selecting Whispering Pines. Have fun while you're there. When you arrive, the cabin will be prepared. Not checking in instructions, no contact details, and no mention of access credentials or keys. When Jake attempted to respond with a request for more information, the email was returned as undeliverable. On a Friday afternoon in early October, we drove down from Ohio using the GPS coordinates that were supplied with the reservation verification. The journey led us past tourist destinations, farther and farther into the mountains, and onto increasingly little roads. For the final 20 miles, we didn't see any other vehicles, homes, or indications of human civilization. As our vehicle ascended a steep dirt road, Jake questioned, "Are you sure we're going the right way? That didn't seem to be wide enough for one car." I looked at the GPS once again. This is unquestionably it. Perhaps they wished to highlight the listing's full privacy aspect. When we eventually arrived at what seemed to be our destination, the sun was already sinking. A woodland clearing with a wood cabin that matched the pictures completely. It was lovely, and the warm light glowed in the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney, creating a golden glow. It was obvious that someone had prepared for our coming. However, something didn't feel right when we parked and got out of the vehicle. It was too quiet. No, there were no insects buzzing, no birds singing, and no wind stirring the trees. The whole woodland seemed to be holding its breath. Unlocking the front door with a message on the counter in the kitchen. "Here at Whispering Pines, welcome. Everything you require has been supplied. Have fun while you're there." Although the calligraphy was exquisite, a fountain pen, it appeared, and it was old-fashioned. The cabin was just as described and in perfect condition. The rustic furnishings had a high-end appearance. One wall was dominated by the stone fireplace, and the views from the deck was stunning. However, it had a sterile quality, more akin to a museum exhibit than a location where people lived and unwinded. We attempted to settle in after unpacking, but little things continued to annoy us. There was food in the refrigerator that we hadn't asked for, local, freshly baked bread. Wine that appeared to be decades old, honey. Clothes in the closets were in our exact huge, antique items that appeared to have been waiting for us. Additionally, even though the reservation confirmation indicated Wi-Fi, with mobile service, there was almost no signal on our phones. This is strange. As we sat on the balcony sipping glasses of the enigmatic wine, I asked Jake, "You mean that? How did they know what, really? How did they know our sizes? Food to get?" Jake shrugged. "Perhaps they have a typical welcome bundle. This type of behavior is definitely common among the wealthy." I had issues that first night, dozing off. There was an oppressive silence outside, and I couldn't shake the impression that someone was observing us through the big windows. When I got up to draw the curtains at 3 in the morning, I noticed something that made my blood boil. Freeze. Lights flickered through the jungle, soft flickering glows instead of headlights or flashlights, like intangible hands holding candles. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns among the trees, never moving. Near the outskirts of view, I shook Jake awake with a whisper, "Gaze outside." However, the lights had gone out by the time he joined me at the window. On the coffee table the following morning, we discovered a leather-bound visitor book that had not been there the previous evening. It contained entries from the cabin had been occupied by couples since the 1970s. Early submissions were positive, complimenting the splendor of the setting and the opulent lodging. However, when we go back over the years, the entry's tone altered. When their stay was over, visitors started talking about experiencing weird nightmares, feeling watched, and finding it hard to leave. Over. A few entries stopped in the middle of sentences. More and more others were written in. Inconsistent penmanship, as though the authors were becoming less grounded in reality. The only 2 weeks before to our arrival, the most recent entry was made. It was composed in a unsteady hand. Day 12. Yesterday we were meant to depart, but the car won't begin. The trails keep taking us back here, even though Jake says we should hike out. The cabin is against us leaving. Don't stay after your checkout time if someone discovers this. Avoid letting it hold you back. I showed Jake the entry with trembling hands. We must go, I said. Correct right now. Jake, though, was oddly composed. Most likely, folks are merely attempting to frighten future visitors. These mountain villages may be, you know. They enjoy ghost stories and legends. I observed that his voice had changed, becoming distant and flat. As I peered inside, his eyes lacked concentration, as if he wasn't really there. We attempted to go for a hike to decompress, but the cabin's surroundings acted irrationally. The paths twisted back toward the cabin from where they should have proceeded down the mountain. Path marks indicated routes that didn't make sense geographically. After hiking for 3 hours, we arrived back on the deck of the cabin, tired and bewildered. During my exploration of the cabin cellar that afternoon, I found something that validated my worst suspicions. A wall behind a pile of antique furniture was covered in pictures. Hundreds of couples our age, all smiling, posing in front of the cabin. Based on the attire and haircuts, the images were taken over several decades. However, this is what made me scream. Jake and I were in the most current image captured in contemporary color. We were wearing clothes I didn't recognize, and they were holding hands and grinning on the deck of the cabin. At the image's bottom, someone had written, "The Richardsons, October," in that same exquisite calligraphy, 2024. They made the decision to remain indefinitely. I hurried upstairs to look for Jake, but he was staring into the fire with that same blank look while sitting still in front of the fireplace. "Jake, I must leave now. This place has a serious problem." He looked over at me, and his eyes briefly cleared. "What's up with me, Emily? I feel as though I'm vanishing." I realized then that the cabin was doing more than just physically trapping people. Their personality, their will to leave, and their ties to the outside world were being gradually erased. It maintained couples as long-term visitors by feeding on their joy and love until they lost sight of their previous lives. I took our car keys. I drew Jake to the door, but he struggled, his blank expression coming back. Why would we go? We arrived just now. 3 nights were paid for. The vehicle wouldn't begin. As though something were stopping it from starting, the engine spun over but refused to catch. I attempted my phone, Jake's phone, and even an old landline that I discovered in the kitchen of the cabin. Nothing was successful. I heard voices outside as darkness fell. There are many of them, all speaking in the same cold, flat voice that Jake had been using. They were shouting our names and extending an invitation to join them for games, dinner, or an eternal vacation that would never stop. Jake was standing at the front entrance when I arrived. With his hand on the knob, he prepared to leave. He said, "They're our friends!" Traily, they had been anticipating our arrival. They wished to give us a tour of the grounds. I needed to make a last-ditch decision. The guest book entry about not staying past checkout came back to me. Time. We had a reservation through Sunday. Good morning. Perhaps that was the secret. I snatched up the guest book and tore out all the pages that had our names or pictures. I saw them burn after tossing them into the fireplace. Jake watched as the evidence of our visit was obliterated by the fire, abruptly regained consciousness. "What's going on, Emily? Where are we?" Outside, the shouts became irate, no longer welcoming and friendly. The cabin started to tremble as though something enormous was. It was being battered from all sides. The lights flashed violently, and the windows cracked. However, the vehicle began. We packed our belongings in the back seat and sped down that dirt road, not knowing that it was safe to do so, halting till we got to the main road. I could see the lights in the cabin dimming in the rearview mirror, and the entire building appeared to be melting into mist for a brief period. Upon arriving home, we looked for the rental. Once more, the website was unavailable. There was no charge on our credit card for the reservation. As though whispering, there had never been Pine's Retreat. However, occasionally on calm evenings when Jake and when we are at home together, we experience the same emotion. A light tug at there is a voice in the back of our thoughts telling us that our true home is in the mountains, waiting for us. Since then, we've relocated twice, but we are followed by the feeling. The mountains keep their visitors in mind, and it's more difficult to turn down some invitations than others. Never trust a rental that looks too good to be true. Your intuition. Because past visitors never return to post negative ratings, certain establishments are inexpensive,